Hello, this is Jo Burke, and on behalf of ISQua, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar with Phil Higton. Phil has been a commercial pilot with British Airways for 34 years. Over the last 10 years, he focused on translating safety practices, particularly around human factors, from aviation into the world of healthcare. In this webinar, Phil will share his experience of successes and failures in doing so. Phil's presentation will last approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll leave 10-15 minutes for any questions you may have. You can ask questions as usual anytime throughout Phil's presentation by typing them or raising your hand. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks very much indeed, and thanks very much for those people who are listening in. I'll try to make this reasonably interesting. I shall do my very best for that. Just a little sort of background. As a commercial pilot, air safety is actually something that is drummed into you. In fact, my first 5 years of commercial flying, we crashed 5 aircraft within what was in those days BEA, and we killed everybody on board, all of them. And so, having grown up in that environment, patient safety as an extension of aviation safety means a huge amount to me. So the goal, the reason that I'm chosen to talk to you today is really that I think that there's quite a lot that can be done to improve patient safety, but the answer isn't simple, is probably what I would summarize my position as. So, as Jo suggested, I've been teaching human factors in healthcare now for more than 10 years. And just trying to translate the messages from aviation into healthcare. And along the way, I've learned quite a lot, and quite a lot about healthcare and quite a lot about teaching human factors in healthcare. It would be very useful for me to have some insight into what you as an audience actually know and understand by healthcare. So we've set up some questions. The first question that I'd like to poll you on is how much you know about human factors within healthcare. And as you can see, there are 4 potential answers there: nothing, a little, a lot, and you're an expert. Could I ask you to cast your vote for one of those solutions? Terrific. So most of you professing to know a little, some a lot, some experts, and relatively few nothing at all. Okay, that's great. The second question is about your current role. So how would you describe your current role? And the choices there are mainly clinical, mainly administrative or managerial, or mainly academic. Okay, that's interesting. Relatively few people from a strictly clinical background, quite a large body within the administrative managerial sphere, and quite a lot of academics. If you're academics, please forgive me, I'm not very academic myself. And the third question I'd just like your opinion on is, whereabouts did your main interest in human factors arise? So as part of clinical teaching, from your interest in patient safety, or as a field of academic study? So if you could answer that, that would be good. And as we say, scores on the door. It's very patient safety focused is really the issue there, with a small amount of the interest coming from academic study as clinical teaching. That's terrific. That allows me to just get my head around where you are. One of the things that we say is that we should always start from where you are rather than where I am. So, shall we set off? Joe, may I have control of the slides back, please? Thank you. Oh, here we go. So, what I'm going to talk about by way of overview is something about hearts over minds. And what I mean by this is that human factors in any field, particularly in healthcare, is actually a behavioral exercise rather than an intellectual one. We have to find a mechanism which actually connects what is fundamentally very basic understanding about human beings, physiology and a degree of psychology, to what we actually do on the day. And that's actually quite a challenge, because more often than not, if you put us under pressure, we don't connect what we know to what we do. The second part is actually about getting past ego. When you buy a ticket on an aeroplane, you don't buy a ticket for a very designated captain or a designated crew member. You simply buy a ticket on an aeroplane, and you have a working assumption that the person is good enough. So it has to be depersonalized. It has to get past a very specific individual. So we have to reframe the things that we do as simply a professional duty rather than actually relying on ego. The next bit is actually about viewing HF in the round. HF is my shorthand there for human factors. So it's about viewing it in the round. It's quite a comprehensive discipline, and we need not to be able to rush off and think, oh, I understand this, therefore I understand it all. The next bit is actually that there are quite a lot of tools around, the WHO checklist, the SBAR communication tools, and others. And very often those are introduced without insight, and we'll have a look at the various forces in play if we try to do that. And the last bit is to actually move towards integration. The issue here is that we have to get to a stage where human factors is not taught as an independent discipline, where human factors is actually taught and refreshed every time that there is a clinical intervention, a clinical training opportunity. It can't be that we teach it separately from the clinical. It has to be wrapped up in the clinical. But it also has to be congruent between different professional groups. If we're to work together in multidisciplinary teams, then we have to be working to a shared model. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve. For some reason, moving the slides forward isn't working for me. Joe, thanks very much. So the next slide. What do we mean by human factors is, I suppose, the next interesting question. Well, human factors is academically part of ergonomics, and ergonomics covers a very wide spectrum. On the left-hand end of the image that you're seeing there is the physical working environment, and it's the design and construction of the workspace. And a little further along the spectrum actually comes the man-machine interface. So you design the space, and then you worry about the interactions between the man and the machine. Then there are other people involved, and so we start to think about group dynamics and team working. That's properly part of human factors too. And at the extreme right-hand end, then we start to think in terms of how do I self-manage? How do I make my behavior fit not only with the people around me, but how do I manage my personal vulnerability, a topic that we're going to come to later. So here we go, we're coming on. The next slide is actually a double helix, and the purpose of this slide is very simply that we will need to think in terms of things which are pulling or pushing against one another. And the reality, unfortunately, is that there are two very powerful influences in how we deliver processes. One is the systematization, the processes that we use. Oh, thank you. Systematization, the processes that we use to actually deliver care. and the other is the people that we use to deliver care. And if I just express it very simply, the goal of systematization is very simply to reduce variability. It's all about increasing reliability. And in order to do that, what we have to do is we have to start to specify. We specify practices, we specify by way of protocols, we have standard ways of doing things. And in terms of reliability, that is critically important. The difficulty is that the more we systematize, the more we treat the people who are involved in the process as units of labor. And that puts us into conflict with the other strand of this helix, and that's the people and culture strand. Because if you consider yourself to be professional, then what did you do all of this training for? What do you want as a human being? Well, what you want is self-actualization. What you want is professional latitude. In fact, the things that you want are the things that are really the polar opposite of the things that the system would like you to do. And so there is a profound tension across the boundary between the two. It's not an unmanageable tension. If we understand why it's there, what its purposes are, then we can work within it. But we have to engage across the boundary. And that means engaging in terms of redesigning systems and processes so that they don't set us up to fail. It means that we sometimes have to surrender a degree of our personal latitude in order to make the system work, because the insight that is available to us in the heat of the moment may be different to the insight that is available from a distant and considered perspective. So it's not an easy solution. There is a tension across the boundary, but that's where we must go. The next slide simply says that in aviation we have at least a part of the solution, and the part of the solution within aviation is a notion called crew resource management. Within healthcare you don't have crews, you have teams. What is crew resource management or team resource management? Very simply, it's a bundle. It's not a clinical bundle, but it's a group of things which actually, hello, I've got a little flag up here. It's a bundle of things which, when you apply them consistently and over time, then you stand the best chance of getting the best from yourself, the best from the people that you work with, and the best from the tools and technology that you use. It's a process of stacking the odds. It's not a guarantee of success in any way, but it is just a mechanism for stacking the odds in your favor. But it has to be applied consistently between professional groups, within professional groups, and over time. Because to deliver that, you need to work effectively in teams, then we need to have some insights into team skills. And if we're to be an effective team player, then we have to understand the human factors that are associated with that. And so that's the way in which the process starts to work. The next issue is to actually think about what are the overarching principles that any potential solution would seek to address. The first of those is that error is normal, and although it's very trite to say it, it's something that we really need to fight against our response to, because very often when error is around, we have sitting at the side of it a sense of blame. When someone makes a mistake, we like to blame them, and we genuinely have to move away from an environment where we blame people for normal, understandable human error. We're not saying here that we don't have the accountability or the responsibility to manage our likelihood of making errors. What we're saying is that the blame is not a solution. Blame does not manage errors. It just drives information underground. And of course, the strength of the response to blame is directly related to the strength of the response, to the consequence of error. So if we have an error which is which provokes, I'm having some fun here, if we have an error which provokes an immediate and a catastrophic outcome, then we say that is a very bad mistake. If we have an identical error which occurs in a more benign environment, we say, oh, it's not significant because it didn't provoke either a immediate or a catastrophic outcome. But the error is the same, so we need to reframe error if we are to manage it. And taking away the notion of blame attaching to error as a starter is actually the way to get started. Something else about error is that we have to deal with the fact that where we are in the social pile is no protector of our likelihood of making a mistake. If our job is to paint signs on roads, we will make mistakes. If our job is to open body cavities and adjust the plumbing therein, then we will make mistakes. So it's not a social thing, it's not a societal thing, it's actually a genetic predisposition. The reason that we are here today is because we have a genetic predisposition to learn by trial and error. And so we have to acknowledge that error is normal. We have a responsibility to manage it and the errors of our professional colleagues, and that requires rather more consideration than we sometimes give it. So the second consideration that we need to have is the fact that performance is variable. And I'm going to show you very briefly a graph, which is a graph that we use when teaching human factors in aviation. And what it does is it plots mean relative performance on the vertical axis and hours of wakefulness on the horizontal axis. And the purpose of this is that we need to we need to accept that our performance varies. And it varies over a variety of time frames and for a variety of reasons. And that means, therefore, that we can't guarantee what our instantaneous level of performance is going to be. And we often find substitute words when we're talking about this. We talk about capability or we talk about capacity. And there's a significant difference between capability, capacity, and performance. And one of the difficulties that we have with performance is that we find it very difficult to measure. In an ordinary job, a day-to-day job with a variety of tasks, we don't have an objective measure of performance instantaneously available to us. So this particular graph, the candidates that allowed us to produce it had to carry out a routine standardized task every 15 minutes over a 36-hour cycle. And by having that, then we were able to actually produce a graph which plotted performance over time. But it's not just this circadian cycle to our performance that is an issue. Performance is different between consecutive days. Performance also varies according to workload and over a much shorter time frame as well. So the key message here is that performance is variable, and if it's variable, then we have a professional responsibility to manage it. The next slide just simply pulls the two ideas that I spoke about together, which is that system and process interact with people and culture. And we have to manage across that boundary. Systems are there to protect us, and we should systematize when the risk is high, but we should give latitude when the risk is relatively low. Because otherwise those people that we turn into units of labor in high-stress environments actually say, well, this isn't a high-stress environment, this isn't a high-risk environment, now is my time, now I should be able to exercise my latitude. And we'll explore that further as we go through. So I think the slide's going to move on for us. There we go. At the heart of managing human factors is an acknowledgement that you are vulnerable. Until such time as we acknowledge human vulnerability, we won't go on to manage it. We can set up all the systems that we like, but no system is foolproof. And if the system doesn't allow us to perform effectively, then there is a fair chance that someone will find a workaround for the system. In aviation, we teach as a separate discipline human performance and limitations, which is about physiology and psychology, and we examine it. But we discovered that examining is not the same as establishing whether people can connect that knowledge into their daily life. So that's where we go. The next image, this hexagon here, actually is talking to the fact that we need to view human factors in the round. There are lots and lots of facets to human factors. And if we had lots of time, we could actually talk around the hexagon about the relevant issues. But there are three things that go wrong significantly with the human condition. The first is about cognition. It's about our ability to make sense of what is going on. Fundamentally, it's a flawed process. There are things that we can do, though, that will help us significantly with that process, partly as an individual activity, but partly operating jointly. And when we start to operate jointly, then the second of the potential traps starts to rear its head. And that's that we fail to share information effectively, professional to professional. So communication failures, if I just referred back to the graph that was shown about errors within surgery a few slides ago, that had communication failures as a very significant issue sitting within errors in surgery and wrong site surgery in particular. And then there's a third issue which we need to think about in terms of failures due to the human condition. And the last of those is choosing behavior. We behave inappropriately. I think it's fair to say that our behavior is situationally dependent. So if we're not very good at the situational awareness thing, then we may not read the situation correctly, and therefore we may select a behavior that's inappropriate for the circumstance. But we also may have our preferred behavior, so we may behave in a way that is comfortable for us, but simply inappropriate. Or a third reason that this goes wrong is very simply that we interpret the environment, our situation, very well, but the pressures upon us, the capacity to control our behavior, is compromised by those pressures, and all of a sudden we end up doing something, either a behavior or an activity, that is inappropriate. So those are the things that go wrong, the things that we need to think about being able to address as we go. I suggested earlier that performance varies, and I spoke about it varying over different time frames between days, within a day, according to a circadian cycle. But what this latest slide here talks to is the way in which our performance varies according to workload. The psychologists refer to some sort of inverted U hypothesis, an arousal curve. So increasing the level of workload, it's workload on the graph, but it could very easily be stress or stimulation. The resulting shape would be, to all intents and purposes, the same. So it rises and then it reaches a peak, your personal best, and then it falls away. That message from that is very simple, that if we turn it on its head, we can see that we can manage performance by managing workload. In fact, we have a professional duty to manage the workload, in particular avoiding the extreme right of the curve part that is obscured by the text, because that's where overload lies. And so we have a responsibility to manage the workload if we are not to render our professional colleagues incompetent. But sitting in this drawing is something else, and that's that as our performance varies between consecutive days, we rarely achieve what is our greatest ever personal best. In fact, we only ever do that once, to be fair. For the rest of the time, we're operating suboptimally in some way. And so one of the marks of a true professional is how you manage that underperformance, how you reduce the amount of underperformance. And that requires you to acknowledge the things that go into underperformance. There's stuff which comes from physiology. If you're tired or fatigued, your performance will deteriorate. But also if you have low blood sugar levels or if you are dehydrated, that will affect your performance. There's stuff to do with the psyche. If you're feeling confident and you're feeling valued, your performance will be good. But if you're being bullied or harassed, your performance will suffer. There is something about the interpersonal dynamic. Some people are simply easier to get on with than others. Some people are technically very competent, but very difficult to be with. There's the environment. That's a physical environment and also an emotional environment. But the physical environment, if it's too hot, too cold, too noisy, too much bustle, too little bustle, that will affect our performance. And then there's that strange relationship that we have with technology. Technology as an enabler, provided that it's working in the way that we anticipated and that we understand how that it works. But the second that it stops working in the way that we expected, or we realize that we don't really know how it works, then it becomes a disabler and consequently will reduce our performance. So that's quite a lot to take in, but it's still on the issue of the variable performance and the likelihood of making mistakes. The next bit was actually about communication, about the way in which we share information. And communication is very complex and multifactorial. We have to think in terms of the communications environment. We have to then go on to think about the, so that's the physical environment, but a large proportion of communication is actually non-verbal. And so we have to think about what the emotional environment is as well, whether we can actually speak truth to power. If we are to speak truth to power, what sort of language is appropriate and useful? And then if we dig down further, we get into the language that we use. And we find that it's very useful to make a significant differentiation between a social vocabulary and a professional vocabulary. And if I were to describe the social vocabulary is fundamentally about building and maintaining relationships. And the characteristic that accompanies that is the fact that it has ambiguity. We talk obliquely rather than talking straight. We hint and we hope. Why? Because the relationship is more important than the task. If we now consider the task actually has a word set all of its own, which is a subset of the social vocabulary. Just hoping to get that to move on. There we go, there we go. If we can go one click forward as well, then we'll see that the legend comes up with professional language. So it's a subset. What we've done when we move into the social, from the social to the professional, is that we've started to cull words. We've taken words out of the vocabulary. Right? Words that breed ambiguity, words which add volume but don't add value, and so we've got a rather more blunt set of language that we can use. And that language is interesting because it's about the task fundamentally, and so we're saying here that the task is paramount, and therefore if the task is paramount, the relationships are less so. And so we have an opportunity for a little bit of an edge here, because we're not building relationships. So the language sounds rather harsh, it sounds rather formulaic, it sounds rather clunky, and is no good. So what this leads us to is that we have to have separate occasions. One occasion when we're building relationships and building the team, and then when we move on to the task, we have to have some general agreement that now the language becomes rather more focused and rather more clunky. On the topic of the language, if we now say, okay, well, this is not just a task, this is now a high-risk task, then we move on one step more with the language. And what we've done by the time that we get up into a crisis where the risk is extremely high is we have reduced the language to single words. The stop, the help, the fire. Because what we've done is we've squeezed the language so that the maximum impact is gained by the minimum number of words. We may say the words more than once, so stop, 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 or fire, 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 for effect, but the message is carried by the word. So the use of language is important, and using the appropriate language in the appropriate setting is equally important. So that's quite an interesting distinction to make. and we find that that works very well. Particularly when we think about the language that we're going to use, because if we moved on to one of the tools that is available to us, the use of checklists, then we first of all need to understand how the tool works, and so there are different tools for different purposes. If I just use an aviation example here, we have 3 different types of checklists within aviation: the normal one, the non-normal, and the emergency. And they have their specific mode of use. So this drives us towards having clarity about the situation that we find ourselves in. But we need to have shared understanding between professionals who are executing any sort of checklist. And because the checklists address different issues, then their structure is necessarily different. This is the way that it works. So how does the language thing work? Well, the language thing works when we start to use checklists by us having, just go on one, here we are. Here is a normal checklist. Now, a normal checklist is what we would recognize in the WHO checklist. The WHO checklist should be what we would refer to as a challenge and response checklist. That is to say, one of the parties would actually make a statement to which there is an appropriate response. And so the function is challenge and response. It's not a conversation. It doesn't have to have a lot of words around, because it's about the task. And what we're saying with this checklist is we are confirming that a particular activity has been undertaken. We don't have to talk about the activity in detail. We simply want to know whether it's finished or not. But the professional language is there. Social language, when using a checklist, is genuinely not appropriate. So that's another issue. What's the next issue? The next issue revolves around team skills. This matrix that is now being shown, the NASA, that's the North American Space Administration, and University of Texas team skills, it was initially generated in aviation. It came as a result of aircraft accidents occurring in the 70s, and the researchers were tasked with observing teams. What we were trying to resolve at that time was that we were looking for behavioral markers that would allow an observer to say, this team is likely to perform well and safely, and this team is likely not to perform so well and not so safely. And so these categories that are listed on the screen there actually have associated with them a variety of markers which an observer would be able to use to report. Now, I have to tell you that the NASA team skills are an excellent method or an excellent tool to be used when teaching human factors, but they're actually a very, very poor tool if your goal is assessment of team skills. Why? Well, lots of history, but just simply because it's not very user-friendly. Within aviation and also within anesthetics and surgery, a different matrix has actually emerged, and that's known as the NOTEX matrix, the non-technical skills matrix. That has a similar set of behavioral markers but has a different layout and structure. Now, the NOTEX matrix is actually very good for evaluating team performance, but it's less good, less useful for teaching human factor skills. So if I draw us back to the NASA team skills, the thing that I'd like you to think about is, out of these 8 topic areas displayed here, one of them is the key to the rest, if you like. One is the one which, if it's not managed appropriately, will start to derail the rest. And I'll just leave you for 30 seconds just to have a read of those categories on the screen, and then I'll share with you my insight. Okay, here we go. I'd just like you to mentally commit to one of the categories being the gatekeeper to the rest. And then when I offer up my particular solution, which is the interpersonal relationships and group climate, just think maybe why I think that rather than you think that. My reason is very simple. This particular box, category, call it what you will, actually relates to the interactions between the individuals within the team. It's about a way of being rather than an activity that you actually undertake. But if you think about the relationships between team members, if the relationships are professional and productive, then the activities that people undertake stand a chance of being professional and productive. But if the relationships are poor, then they don't. Very specifically, if we look at the box on the left-hand side, one up from the bottom, labeled team self-feedback. This is the mechanism by which a team regulates its behavior. Well, if the relationships between team members are poor, then the regulation of that behavior is likely to be poor because we have a barrier, a very significant barrier to having open, frank and honest conversations about the behaviors that are influencing the team's performance. Similarly, if the relationships are poor, then the briefing becomes a one-way process rather than an exploratory discussion about the best way to do something. And so we have someone who is describing exactly how it's going to be, treating people as units of labor, rather than a consultative process, where appropriate, to get the best mechanism for performing whatever the task is. If we also look at the conflict between the interpersonal relationships and the box on the bottom left, labeled inquiry, advocacy and assertion, this is important because inquiry, advocacy and assertion is actually about how team members in healthcare speak actually get to contribute their opinions and get to contribute their knowledge into a debate. Inquiry is in effect the boss saying, should we? Advocacy is saying we should, and assertion is in effect saying we must. Well, if the relationships are poor, then one of the first things which becomes compromised is this sharing of information. People don't speak up. They start to withhold because the only power that they have is the power to withhold. Thinking about power, I'll move on to the next slide. And just moving on, here we go. If you're the leader of a team, you still need to get things done. And one of the interesting principles that we need to talk around in any human factors discussions is a notion called the authority gradient. And it's widely misrepresented as being something about hierarchy. And so we really need to be clear what it is and what it isn't. This slide here, getting things done, suggests that there are in effect two ways that the boss or the leader can exercise control over the group and over outcomes. The first is something which relates to power of position. And power of position is about hierarchy. There is a pecking order. And if we think about translating that into the delivery of healthcare, we have a pyramid. We have a pyramid, several pyramids within organizations which describe the hierarchy. We can have a medical hierarchy, we can have a nursing hierarchy, we can have an administrative hierarchy, and the levels within the hierarchy fix the points at which responsibility for particular decisions and particular outcomes reside. And so we know what the pecking order is within those hierarchies. But the reality is that when we deliver care within a healthcare setting, we don't work within our hierarchies. We actually take one doctor, one nurse, one administrator, one something else, and we form them into a team to execute a particular task. Well, what does that do to the hierarchy? Does the say-so of a junior doctor, for example, trump the say-so of a senior nurse. We have no idea what the hierarchy is in traditional language when we start to form an ad hoc team to execute a task and then move on to a different ad hoc team to execute a different task. What we find is being used when we're running teams on the go, changing tasks, changing locations, changing relationships, is that it's not actually the ascribed power that people are using. It's the power of position. So the authority gradient actually is something different. The authority gradient is about power in relationships. And if you like to think about the sources of power within relationships, they may come from power of position. They may come from power of knowledge. They may come from a certain presence. So some people may express their views very powerfully. There are lots and lots of sources of power. And one of the issues that we need to have here is that every time that there is a significant power gradient, an authority gradient between the leader and the led, then the led start to withhold information. And if your job is to actually gain the best informed information in order to have the best informed decision, then steep authority gradients, very significant differences of power between the players, is a disadvantage. In aviation, what we try to do is to have a shallow authority gradient for routine practice as we can get away with. And that means forming personal relationships and asking the junior team members for their contribution and valuing their contribution and sharing information with them. All of these things to reduce the power difference between the boss and the troops, if you will. So that's the authority gradient. Shallow authority gradients within aviation are associated with much better safety performance than steep authority gradients. But the good news here is that it's variable, and it's variable almost instantaneously. In the consultation part of the briefing, we can have a shallow gradient to make sure that everyone contributes. When it comes to making the decision and the boss carries the can, then we can call upon a steep authority gradient because, quite simply, the boss does carry the can. The boss gets the right to choose. So having a variable authority gradient, movable by the second, is actually a prominent characteristic of safety within aviation. Use it widely. So it's nearly time for you to ask me questions. If I just reiterate where we've been to over the last 45 minutes or so, issues that I would seek to address. One issue is that we have to connect what we know to what we do. That it can't be an intellectual exercise. It's got to be a behavioral exercise. That we have to set our ego on one side and say, patient safety is about safety for the patient. I am simply an enabler. This is not about me. So safety is a professional duty. That we have to see that human factors study is actually quite a complex thing. It's a multifactorial thing. And we can't actually treat it as if it were very simple. We have to understand the complexity, which means that we sometimes have to simplify to understand and then acknowledge the complexity that way. Using tools without insight is really about getting the best from the tools that are and techniques that are available. There is a passion for just simply importing ideas from somewhere else. Intellectually, they're very simple, very straightforward. But unless we understand the rationale, unless we understand how they use, and unless we have an environment that uses them appropriately, then we don't get the benefit out of the tools. And if I was just to point to the WHO checklist as an example of that, we can audit the compliance with the WHO checklist, but we're fooling ourselves. We're auditing compliance with the fact that the checklist has been ticked or used. We're not actually auditing whether or not it is being used effectively. And then the last bit is about the integration, that we work in multidisciplinary teams. We work carrying out clinical tasks. So we have to have a shared view across multidisciplinary teams. We also have to have the knowledge integrated with the clinical teaching. So this is what you do, this is how you do it, this is why you do it, and this is how we all do it together. So integration has to be an accepted norm. And where that takes you to is that the teaching of human factors within healthcare is not actually the role of an outsider from aviation. The teaching of human factors within healthcare is actually about enabling healthcare professionals to incorporate a human factors message, a relevant human factors message, in all of their teaching at every teaching opportunity as they go about their daily lives. So you've heard about me and my views. I'll be very interested in listening to your views.
Thank you so much, Phil. We already have a couple of questions. First one coming from Sam McIntyre. Did Terima develop the safety hexagon diagram or someone else?
Terima developed the diagram. If we were to teach over 2 days, we would actually have 8 separate topics within that. One that is missing is an introduction, and the second that is missing is personality. In a sense, we have to take personality away and shoot it. And the reason that we would take personality away and shoot it is that we can't change anybody's personality. We can't expect them to change their personality, but we have to understand how personality informs behavior, so that we can then move on to say, okay, your personality informs behavior when you are under stress, but you have a professional responsibility to manage your behavior as best you are able. So yes is the easy answer. It was a Terima guide, and we use it in our teaching.
Thank you. Dirk, the corner is asking, are doctors comparable to pilots? To which extent?
That's a really interesting question. I think that the answer is there are some comparisons. We're both human, or we're all human. There are differences, and there are differences in the way that they're trained, there are differences in the ways that they're recruited, and there are differences in the way that they're rewarded. It would be very foolish of me to say, actually, it works in aviation, therefore it should work in healthcare. What are the differences? The differences are fundamentally that doctors are a damn sight cleverer than pilots. Intellectually, they run rings around pilots. They're very clever people. But with that cleverness actually comes a bit of a weakness, which is that they see things, instead, if somebody tells them that this is how we do it, a pilot will say, okay, yeah, that seems fair, but a doctor will say, oh, actually, but where's the evidence for that? And the difficulty about evidence is that in human factors teaching, the evidence is not hard and robust. It's not, just trying to think of the right word. You'll see that pilots are not very good at these word things. We don't have anything other than, just trying to think how I'm saying this, linking cause and effect is actually difficult, and even more so within healthcare. But what we can say is that within aviation, 75% of aircraft accidents and incidents have been as a result of a failure of a human being somewhere along the line. That's a tremendous proportion. And we can actually say that with confidence because we have the ability to reconstruct aircraft accidents. We have the flight data recorder, we have the cockpit voice recorder, and so we're able to reconstruct with a degree of fidelity that is not possible in healthcare. In healthcare, very often the inquest, if you like, is carried out at some remove from the event. We rely hugely on people's memories, which are very poor. We rely on their interpretation of events, which is probably very biased for all sorts of reasons. And so we can't say for sure how things are. But doctors are cleverer than pilots on average, and that's a bit of a weakness.
Great, thank you. Terry Dickerson has made a comment that there are bold pilots and old pilots, but no bold old pilots.
It's a truism, to be honest. Actually, being seen as not gung-ho in commercial aviation is actually seen as a strength. And that harks back to this notion that we have to take ego out of it. There are people who talk about, oh, well, in aviation, if you crash the aeroplane, you die, but in healthcare, somebody else dies. Well, in a way, why would that actually affect how I behave? You would think maybe that if I'm going to die, I'm going to be more careful or more circumspect. But the reality is that if I die, somebody else gets to muck out the loft and clean out the garage. I'm taken out of the equation. Whereas within healthcare, if you are associated with a catastrophic event, you by and large live. And so you become the second victim, and you carry the burden of that second victim for the rest of your life. And I think that my solution is very quick and easy, and a healthcare solution is very harsh. Living with that sort of burden would, I suspect, be very, I don't know, it would destroy a person. And in fact, I know people who it has destroyed, or at least has taken a very serious toll on.
Thank you. Our fellowship candidate, Mohammed Al-Badani, is asking, human performance can be affected by internal and external factors in the organization. So how can we manage this issue and enhance our performance?
That's terrific. And that goes down to leadership. It's the leadership of the organization, but it's also the leadership at the team and department level. It's about setting out your stall. Your performance will be affected by how clearly your goals are defined, about how well you're rewarded for doing the right thing, or how ambiguous the reward is. And so what leadership should be doing is actually saying, this is what we're trying to achieve, this is our aspiration, if you like, and then allowing the layers underneath to actually reframe that aspiration in terms of patient safety and the activities that they undertake. So part of it is about the mechanical process. It's about the systems and the processes and all of the rest of the stuff. But a huge amount of that is actually about whether people engage with it, whether they engage with the ethos of the organization, whether they engage with the aims of the organization, and whether they're prepared to surrender something in order to make the goals of the organization align with their own goals. So is patient safety important? Yes. Does the organization say that patient safety is important? Yes. Does the organization do things that support me to deliver patient safety? Let's hope that the answer is yes. It's not a perfect world. There's no guarantees with any of this. But I'm sure that matching the aspiration through the various tiers of an organization is absolutely critical to success.
Thank you. Another one of our listeners, Bruno Lucet, is asking, people often say that it's easier in aviation than in healthcare because pilot is in the plane. What's your opinion?
Yeah, it's easier, but it's easier for a different reason than the pilot is in the plane. It's easier because it's a lot less complex. In aviation, the task is relatively simple. You gather people together, you put them in a piece of aluminium tube, and the task is to actually transport them from here to there safely. They get on the airplane fit and well, they have a reasonable expectation of getting off the airplane similarly fit and well. In healthcare, people come in broke, and so not all of them leave properly mended. Now, why does that matter? It matters because of the complexity of it all. Healthcare is profoundly complex in a way that aviation isn't. With aviation, we have one regulator per country. We have an organization which defines standard procedures. We have a crew of 2, or if you include the cabin crew, a crew of up to 20. They're relatively simple tasks, and we also have a relatively well-defined task. Within healthcare, what have you got? You've got a constantly changing team operating in a complex environment with fragile patients. The task is much, much more difficult. And you don't just have one regulator or regulating body. You have hundreds of regulating bodies, or at least people who exert influences upon the practices that you undertake. And so it's much more complex in healthcare than it ever was in aviation.
Thank you very much. And our ISQua board member and fellowship candidate, Professor Cliff Hughes, is asking a question. She took questions. Given that personality is not changeable, is it not the ultimate human factor?
Yeah, no is the easy answer. It's not changeable, but it's provided that you haven't got a personality defect, then I would argue that it's actually about management, and I don't think that it's really a defect. I think it's, as we used to say in computers, you know, it's not a fault, it's a feature. If it was a fault, maybe you could do something about it, but if it's a feature, then you have to work with it. Just going back to my comments about personality, the issue here is that, yes, we need to understand it. We need to understand that different people that are marching to different drums. We need to understand that we talk about it in terms of types, so we're thinking about preferences as we go through personality. But preference doesn't mean that that is the only choice. And so the human factor is actually about saying, what can I not change? What can I change? Well, let's set aside the stuff that I can't change. Let's acknowledge its influence, but let's deal with the stuff that I can do something about. And by managing my behavior, managing my environment to help me to manage my behavior, then I can minimize the impact of personality on it all.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting point.
It is, and actually Cliff also continues asking, should we not then be developing a situational awareness predicting how our team might react in given circumstances?
Yes, in fact, but where that takes you to is to actually have mechanisms for sharing situational awareness. So it's actually how you make sense of what's going on, and making sense of what's going on is a cognitive process. One of the slides that I could have shown you but I didn't was actually about a conflict, and it's what we call in aviation a think-do conflict. And the notion that sits behind it comes from René Amelberti, who's a psychologist, and he said that by and large we only have one brain. In order to have more than one brain, we'd have to be a dinosaur, and I happen to know that there are no dinosaurs in aviation because we haven't been around that long, and I have it on good authority that there are no dinosaurs in healthcare either. So we have one brain, and that one brain has two distinct tasks to execute. One is all of the cognitive processing, the thinking axis, and the other is the control of motor function process. So that's the doing axis. And Amelberti's particular insight was that we don't have sufficient capacity to work flat out in both dimensions simultaneously. So if we have a very high demand to think, then we have a relatively low residual capacity for doing stuff. And you can actually see this acted out if you just go down the high street on a Saturday, and the people are walking at a reasonable pace along the pavement, and then the person in front answers their telephone. This is now an increase in cognitive activity because you're having to listen and think about what they're saying, and that individual will now slow down. They will fail to walk in a straight line. In fact, from time to time, you will see them engage in dressage. They will look at the pavement, they will walk sideways, they will do all manner of silly things. This is just simply that cognitive processing, that desire to understand, has actually compromised their ability to walk in a straight line. So this think-do conflict is very important to us. And if we are to understand situations clearly, then we have to manage our workload down. We have to reduce the amount of doing that we undertake so that we can actually control that. If we do need to do doing, if the situation is such that we have to act, then ideally what we would do is do the thinking first and then do the acting. But if we can't, then we need to split our resources so that the person doing the doing, carrying out the activity, is different to the person who is controlling the scene, the person who is actually doing the thinking. There's a huge amount in situational awareness, but one of the things is actually making sure that as an individual or as a group, you have access to the maximum amount of brain in order to do it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it was a nice little rant, wasn't it?
It was. Thank you very much. And by the way, actually, Renee that you just mentioned is ISQua board member as well. Okay, I have loads of questions flowing. I'm not sure if you're able to answer all of them because we're approaching 1 o'clock. But very, very quickly, our first fellow, ISQua fellow, Andreas Becker, Professor Andreas Becker is asking that one important point to support human factor in hospital is to teach it. We just started a course in one of our biggest hospitals, 1,200 beds, in our hospital group where we teach doctors, nurses and managers in patient safety. It is a 120-hour course with 24-hour only for human factor and team topics. In total, 120 people will join the course over 2 years. And he just wanted to mention this and just to say that he really, really enjoyed the session.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. In fact, it requires it to be understood, taught and used very broadly across healthcare. And that sounds like a wonderful intervention, wonderful intervention.
Roshan Boland says that it's good to hear Phil acknowledge that healthcare is more complex than aviation. However, the lessons learned from aviation for some reason have not been taken on board by health staff on the whole. What can we do to solve this issue once and for all?
I don't think that you solve it once and for all. And if I was to be frank about aviation, we go through cycles, and periodically we have brought to our attention that yet another airplane has been lost for reasons that are not associated with a technical challenge or a catastrophic failure. So we are consistently reminded of it in aviation. But the more successful you are, the further you...
Hello? Hello, Phil? Hello?
It's manage it, you consistently deliver best practice, and it stacks the odds in favor of success, but it doesn't guarantee it.
Okay. Phil, we have another question from Terry Dickerson. Surely there are a whole range of tasks from routine to complex. Choose approaches and methods to fit these. Is it too simple to have a blanket term healthcare?
It is, but it's simplistic shorthand. I acknowledge that. And I was at the patient safety conference last week, and what was very interesting there, again from René Amalberti, was actually saying that if you stratify risk, then your response is different according to where in the stratification you are making your intervention. And like so much of what René says, it was blindingly obvious, but it required to be said for us to actually realize that it was blindingly obvious. And so, yes, we need a variety of interventions which work in a variety of environments, risk environments, but we need to have some basic intellectual underpinning for that, and we need congruence across the patch. Otherwise, we just end up with just a point source intervention which doesn't produce the goods and certainly doesn't sustain over time. And I mentioned earlier on that the idea is that it's a bundle of stuff that you do consistently over time in order to stack the odds in favor of success. It's not a guarantee. It's a lifetime's work. So lots of work for everyone involved in ISQua, I suspect.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We still have many, many questions, so my apologies.
I'm happy to carry on if you're happy to carry on.
Oh, okay. Okay, perfect. So maybe we'll just go for two last questions. Most healthcare reforms are dependent on aviation fields, while the medical and aviation are different. So is it correct to say that we need to improve our performance in healthcare field? This is from Mohammed Al-Badani.
I think that it's actually quite dangerous to use a direct parallel with aviation. And if I were to give you an example, it would be the characteristics of high-risk organizations or the use of root cause analysis. One of the difficulties about using root cause analysis in the way that it is done in healthcare in the UK is that the same incidents are analyzed time and time again, the same root causes are identified time and time again, and the solutions seem to fail time and time again. And whether that's that the solutions are not appropriate or the root cause hasn't been appropriately identified, I can't say. But I think that to use that as a mechanism is rather better done if you already have a high reliability organization. And what healthcare is not right now is a high reliability organization. It doesn't have any of the attributes of it. And one of the issues about the attributes of high reliability organizations is that you can actually list the things that people do in high reliability organizations, one of which is first name terms. And for example, first name terms of itself will not make a blind bit of difference. It's what underpins the first name terms. It's actually the reduction of the authority gradient, it's the open communications environment, it's the appropriate group climate, it's all of those things. So first name terms, if you like, is a symptom, but it's not actually the thing that's driving it. It's a recognizable facet of it rather than a driver.
Okay. Thank you very much. And the final question, you said, this is from Dirk de Corne, you said doctors and pilots are trained, rewarded and recruited differently. Should we therefore not look to aviation-like recruitment system, for example, include personality and human factor assessments before even starting medical school?
Interesting. I think that there is certainly a change in the UK in doctor recruitment. I think my concern would be that if you recruit for academic excellence and you examine as an individual looking for excellence, and then once you have built that excellence, you then put them into a team environment, I think that by the time that they leave med school, doctors have already decided how the world works. They know that they get rewarded by passing exams, being able to demonstrate competence and stuff. And since assessment of team skills or assessment of multi-professional working is actually, it's in its infancy within healthcare, we don't get a chance to do that. Whether the aviation model, I don't think necessarily the aviation model's there, but you should certainly recruit for aptitude to work in a multidisciplinary team and then train them for skills working in a multidisciplinary team. But they have to have sufficiently powerful intellect to be able to cope with the complexity and diversity of all of the knowledge that they'll need to actually be an effective doctor. So it's something that comes as a consequence of healthcare being probably more intellectually challenging than flying.
Thank you very much, Phil. And Phil, there are many questions now flowing, not questions, but gratitude, messages of gratitude flowing, saying how helpful the session was and how enjoyable it was. So thank you once again for your presentation, and thank you also to all participants for your attendance and questions. The recording of this...
Can I just chip in before you...
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
but we have one poll left, which is poll number 4. And it was just nice to get some data on it. Poll number 4, it actually says, how would you best describe this webinar? And the choices are interesting, informative and useful, informative and useful, interesting, nothing new, or boring. How are we doing on that score? Oh, not too bad. Oh, at least there was nothing in the nothing new or the boring bits, so that's a bit of a result. Back to you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Phil. The recording of this webinar will be available online within the next 24 hours. So if you think of someone who might benefit from it, please forward it to them. And if you have any questions about the webinar, you can contact myself at jburke@isqua.org. Or if you have any questions about ISQua Fellowship Program, you can contact us through the ISQua website at www.isqua.org education. Thank you once again for attending ISQua webinar, and we hope to see you very soon at our next webinar, which is with Dr. Anna Barker, who is currently running the world's largest trial in hospital falls prevention. So thank you and goodbye.